marital relationship is not a sin at all. It's an absolute duty. And the procreation of children is a duty. It is a problem you might be thinking about a bit. 2 weeks from now, I think they have, Paul, would you know, the big mission meeting here? We had a conflict last week with it. Is it 2 weeks from now? Palm Sunday evening. There'll be a conflict. So we'll meet at the regular time next week here, 7 o'clock at 9. But you might think what we're going to do. The last time, remember, we moved the class up to 3 o'clock, 2:30, I guess, in the afternoon. We won't make any decisions tonight, but think about it. Next week will be a normal week at 7 o'clock. But let's settle next week what we're going to do about the following week when the mission meeting is on and affects a good many of you there. On page 157, we have the discussion of the Augustinian doctrine. I've already mentioned a little bit about the philosophical element of Augustine's doctrine. I don't think I need take more time on that. But on page 159, Hodge gives his critique of that view, which has certainly been a powerful view in the history of the Christian church, but it's also powerfully resisted by Hodge, and I would say by the majority. Hodge represents a majority Reformed opinion on this viewpoint, so it may be interesting to read his critique on page 159, Augustine's reasons for making sin a negation. Now, this is positive. Hodge disagrees with the fact that sin can be accounted for by the mere absence of good, of falling away from God. It has to be a potent principle that drives people to do the evil which they do. Now, Augustine's made a mistake on that, he thinks, which has had tremendous, unfortunate influence in the history of the church, but at the same time... Well, I didn't get that. What?
You're okay. That's okay. We thought your microphone was on.
Okay. Don't tell me I did something right here. No wonder I couldn't understand what you were saying. That here he's trying to show that in spite of the fact this is a very unfortunate doctrine, nevertheless, Augustine, he recognizes as a great father of the church. As said in the Reformation, without Augustine, you just can't conceive of a Luther or a Calvin or a Hodge. This man, his influence is monumental. And if he makes a mistake, it's like the sons of Noah covering his nakedness. He got drunk on an occasion. And the proper sons recognized this as a worthy father who had fallen into sin in this particular area. And instead of exposing his corruption, they tried to cover it. In a certain sense, that's the way Hodge feels about Augustine on this subject. This is a bad mistake, he thinks. But at the same time, when Augustine makes it, you can be sure there's something good in it someplace. And he's trying to point out what's good about it and what's good about Augustine's intention, even when his execution is not successful. And that's making sin negation. Augustine had principally two ends in view. One, to show that sin is not necessary. We were developing this, with the respect to Leibniz the last time. Sin is not necessary. If it were something existing of itself or something created by the power of God, it was beyond the power of man. He was its victim, not its author. And that is not the case in Augustine, so he does not want to give the impression that sin is necessary. It is not necessary. And secondly, he desired to show that it was not due to the divine efficiency. That's the main thing, without doubt. See, Augustine was a great Calvinist. He was a great sovereignty man. God decreed everything that came to pass. His counsel stands fast. His greatest Calvinist of all time since the Apostle Paul, without question. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, he was equally zealous to maintain that though God ordained evil, and there wouldn't be any evil if God hadn't ordained it, God cannot do evil. He's incapable of doing evil. He is not the author of the evil in the sense of the producer of it. And he desired, says Hodge, to show that it was not due to the divine efficiency. God could not do evil. He could decree it, but he could not do it. So since he decreed it without doing it, how do you explain it? You explain it, according to Augustine, by the notion that God's efficiency wasn't there. It's because of God's absence, in other words. Just as Edwards, who has basically the same type of view, would say, how can you blame God for something when it's his very absence which is the occasion for it? It's the ultimate irony to say that God's the author of sin if it's only when God is absent that sin occurs. and so on. And certainly it's true of both Edwards and Augustine that they were determined to preserve the integrity of God and his freedom from any sin or guilt, even though he did decree sin and guilt that wouldn't exist without his decree. According to his theory of God's relation to the world, not only all that is, every substance is created and upheld by God, but all activity or power, all energy by which positive effects are produced is the energy of God. If sin, therefore, was anything in itself, anything more than a defect or a want of conformity to a rule, God must be its author. He therefore took such a view of the psychological nature of sin that it did not require an efficient, but as he often said, only a deficient cause. Causa deficiens, not causa efficiens. He'd say that in most of his writings there. If a man, to use the old Augustinian illustration, strike the chords of an untuned harp, he is the cause of the sound, but not of the discord. So God is the cause of the sinner's activity, but not of the discordance between his acts and the laws of eternal truth and right. Now remember, this is Hodge giving his tribute to Augustine, even when Augustine made what he feels is a very serious error. And again, he's continuing somewhat that same theme under the head of the moral element of his doctrine. The true Augustinian doctrine of sin was that which the illustrious father drew from his own religious experience as guided and determined by the Spirit of God. It'd be better to say his interpretation of the Bible. This always bothers me in Hodge. He's so eager to show that what is biblical is also natural and truly human that he sometimes sounds as if the Word of God was subordinate to his common sense judgment. He was one. Augustine was one once conscious of sin. He recognized himself as guilty and polluted, as amenable to the justice of God and offensive to his holiness. 2, he felt himself to be thus guilty and polluted not only because of deliberate acts of transgression, but also for his affections, feelings, and emotions. This sense of sin attached not only to these positive and consciously active states of mind, but also to the mere absence of right affections, etc. 3, he recognized the fact that he'd always been a sinner. 4, he was deeply convinced he had no power to change his moral nature. 5, it was involved in this consciousness of sin as including guilt or just liability to punishment as well as pollution, that it could not be a necessary evil. And so he goes. You see, all these are in Augustine's favor, even though he's got an unfortunately wrong doctrine. And in the next page, 161, he shows the biblicality of a number of his ideas. I don't think I need to go through this. On page 162, he comes to a bit of a climax on this subject. This is the Augustinian system in all that is essential. It is this which has remained and been the abiding form of doctrine among the great body of evangelical Christians from that day to this. It is, of course, admitted that Augustine held much connected with the several points above mentioned, which was peculiar to the man or the age in which he lived, but which does not belong to Augustinianism as a system of doctrine. As Lutheranism does not include all the individual opinions of Luther, and as Calvinism does not include all the personal views of Calvin, so there is much taught by Augustine which does not belong to Augustinianism. He taught that all sin is the negation of being, that liberty is ability, so that in denying to fallen man ability to change his own heart, he denies to him freedom of the will. That concupiscence, in the lower sense of the word, as an instinctive feeling is sinful. That's against the Roman view. That's the reason he's stressing that. That a sinful nature is propagated by the very law of generation. That baptism removes the guilt of original sin, and that all unbaptized infants, as Romanists still teach and almost all Protestants deny, are lost. These are some of his errors connected with it. These and other similar points are not integral parts of his system and did not receive the sanction of the Church when it pronounced in favor of his doctrine as opposed to that of the Pelagians or liberals. In like manner, it's a matter of minor importance how he understood the nature of the union between Adam and his posterity, and so on. Down a line or so. It is enough that he held that such was the union between Adam and his race that the whole human family stood their probation in him and fell with him in his first transgression. He goes into showing biblical there, and he gives some other objections. He concludes on page 164 with these last items. From this it is plain, 1, that Augustine had no clear and settled conviction as to the nature of the union between Adam and his race, which is the ground of the imputation of his sin to his posterity, any more than he had about the origin of the soul. He's usually associated with this immediate imputation and this realism view that Edwards is associated, and that Hodge critiques more fully in Edwards than he does in Augustine here. 2, that no particular theory on that point, whether the representative or realistic, can properly be made an element of Augustinianism. He had the realistic view, and Hodge believes the representative view is the sound one. So Augustine erred on that, but what he's saying is here, it can't be called a part of Augustinianism as a historical and church form of doctrine. I mentioned to you last year, part of the reason for taking Augustine so seriously is that even the liberal scholars recognize that he's the ultimate defender of the faith they don't like. I think I mentioned to you a friend of mine at Harvard years ago who was a research fellow up there working with Alfred North Whitehead, the father of the process theology and one of the most important philosophical thinkers of the 20th century. And my friend was telling me that he'd said to him on one occasion, Augustine's the man we've got to take out. And this friend of mine who was a research fellow there with Whitehead, was not about to take Augustine out. He was a great defender of Augustine and so on. But in the opinion of Whitehead, Augustine, more than any historical Christian theologian, stood between him and his goal of really eradicating Orthodox Christianity in favor of his process type of theology. And most people have recognized that. This is part of the reason. Now, for example, for every person who's ever heard of Charles Hodge, 1,000 people have heard of Augustine. And so on. This man, for example, Whitehead, I doubt if he ever heard of Charles Hodge. I'm sure he never read Hodge and so on, but he read Augustine. Nobody who's at all knowledgeable in any field of religion has been ignorant of Augustine. And Augustine's the great champion of orthodoxy. This is the reason Hodge is saying, even when he's unorthodox, he has orthodox motivation in many ways, and there are very many orthodox aspects about him, even when he errs. I think it's a very proper thing for us with our father. We honor our father or mother. We still oppose them when it's necessary. You don't accept it just because Augustine said it. You differ with him when you think he is wrong, but you do so with consummate respect when he's clearly a father of the church, as certainly Augustine actually was. Yes, please.
How do the Roman Catholics view Augustine?
They view him as the second greatest father in the church. They've got about 20 church theologians whom they call fathers of the church. The greatest is Thomas Aquinas. The second greatest is Augustine. They have no right to him. I mean, he's no Roman Catholic. He has certain Romish ideas, for example, baptismal regeneration. And even on this matter of the transmission of sin, they're more orthodox than Augustine actually was. But the idea that he's rightly claimed by Rome. See, Warfield is more generous than I am on that. Warfield has said you have to give Augustine to the Roman Catholics in his ecclesiology and his doctrine of the sacraments. There's a certain element of truth in that. Baptismal regeneration. He held that doctrine. As I have to admit, I'm sorry about it. He also held the doctrine that Hodge mentions in passing here, that unbaptized children perish. They perish. It's an awful thing that one of the greatest fathers of the church taught that doctrine, but it's connected with his baptismal regeneration doctrine. But he certainly had a basic concept of justification by faith. He recognized the doctrine of predestination, total depravity, and so on. He was a Calvinist. Calvin was an Augustinian. Augustine was a Calvinist. Calvin was an Augustinian. Luther was an Augustinian. I mean, they stood on Augustine's shoulders. They were great men, but they don't compare with Augustine in original insight and powerful influence and so on. But Rome can claim him with respect to baptismal regeneration and certain other things. And I mentioned this morning, for example, you remember how they did deny the doctrine of assurance. That comes right out of Augustine. There, just as a number of the doctrines that John Paul is standing for so firmly today about procreation and so on are purely Augustinian and out of line with most of the Roman Catholic thinking at the present time. But that's their story, and they feel that Calvin and the Calvinists are people who have carried Augustine to an extreme. That would be their view of it. I'd say they have no right to Augustine. He belongs to us. He's a Protestant saint. They would say, no, he's a Roman Catholic saint. You Protestants, Calvinists and so on, have taken a certain aspect of Augustine and run to a fatalistic extreme with it. That's their view of the thing, which manifestly I don't think is true. Anything else? Yes, please. Yes, they referred to him as a sage in the West. See, he appeared on the scene. He died in AD 430, you see, and until that time there really had never been a towering theologian in the West. The East was still the center of Christian development. You had Cyprian, who was very strong in ecclesiology, but not a great theologian. And Irenaeus had, he was an Easterner who became Bishop of Lyon in France, and he had some, but the first towering theologian of the West was Augustine. So the East sat up and took notice, and they'd refer to the sage in the West, you know, as if the new kid in the block, Johnny come lately. See, the West is coming on the scene. And so, of course, he towers over anything they've had in the East. They've never had a theologian that approximates the prowess of Augustine. So they have a respect for him. But they don't think in the Augustinian way. They don't really have a doctrine of total depravity. Sin they take seriously, but the idea of total depravity in the Augustinian sense and the idea of an absolute regeneration by the Holy Spirit of God and all, they don't have it. But Augustine, of course, did have this baptismal regeneration idea, but he had it coupled with the idea of predestination, which has never found comfortable lodging in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And even with respect to the baptismal regeneration, it's only the elect who will remain in a state of grace and die in a state of grace. You see, that's alien to Roman thinking or Eastern thinking too. In other words, they recognize Augustine as a giant. He can't sin anybody. As they say, Alfred North Whitehead, he's the enemy. He's a gigantic enemy. He's a giant in anybody's book. He's a giant hero in my book and Hodge's book and Luther's book and so on. But in anybody's book, he's a giant. But you don't have to be an Augustinian to say that. As I say, in the American scene, Edwards is that way. People who are utterly anti-Edwardsian, they recognize they've got to, as far as American theology is concerned, the man you've got to take is Jonathan Edwards, not Charles Hodge, not W.G.T. Shedd, not Henry Smith, not Berkouwer or anybody like that. The person you've got to take is Jonathan Edwards. He's the bad guy. He's the good guy. Depends on your view of his theology, but he's a giant in anybody's book. But Augustine is the giant among the giants as far as the history of the Christian church is concerned. The very fact that Rome can claim him as next to Aquinas, you don't even mention in the same breath with Augustine. It's a strange thing, but nevertheless, the reason he's father number one in Roman thinking is that he sort of cleaned up Augustine's act a little bit, you see. He's a little less deviant at certain points. He's not the genius that Augustine was, but he nevertheless was more accurate. Just as Hodge is a sounder theologian than John Calvin. You don't mention in the same breath with John Calvin as a genius, but nevertheless, these geniuses are often pioneers. You know, they're clearing the underbrush, they're trying to make a way, and the other people who come after them, they build a house. You know, it's a beautiful thing, and so they couldn't possibly have done it if these people hadn't gone before and cleaned the area and laid a foundation, and so on. But they get the credit for the building of the house, you see, but they couldn't possibly have done it without these predecessors. So that's a general recognition, Eastern and so on. But you see what Hodge is saying here. This is very significant coming from Hodge, because Hodge, predestinarian Augustinian, total depravity Augustinian, priority regeneration Augustinian, inability doctrine of Augustine, and so on. But at the same time, strongly opposed to this way of accounting for sin as just the absence of the good. That strikes at the gut of, just as you'll find him taking the same kind of criticism of Edwards's view of identity. It's 8:30 already. We only have a half an hour. And I won't take any time with the diversity of sentiment in the Latin Church. Notice it says Latin Church rather than Catholic Church there. And Abelard, Thomas Aquinas mentioned. Thomas Aquinas, I won't give him to the Roman Catholics either, not to mention Augustine, and so on, except at certain points. But he's father number one in their views. And there are some things that he certainly believed there ought to be a single head of the church, and that should be the Pope at Rome. That he ever held to the doctrine of infallibility? No, as I said last time, he didn't believe in the perpetual virginity of Mary either. There were a number of points, and as far as his doctrine is concerned, I think I've quoted before Harnack's statement that if the church in the 16th century had followed Thomas Aquinas on justification, the Reformation wouldn't have been necessary. That's his way of indicating that while he doesn't state it with the kind of precision that the polemics of Luther and so on brought about, he nevertheless was stating essentially the same doctrine that they were teaching in this matter. And if that is true, certainly he's primarily a Protestant, not a Roman Catholic. Anybody who differs on justification, as Harnack, the liberal, thinks that he did, and Gerstner, the conservative things that he did would certainly be fatal to his being a Roman Catholic, when that is the ultimate heresy, and that's what you're anathematized for believing, as we noticed this morning. But at any rate, the Scotus were people who opposed. So if you ask some questions, all right. Otherwise, I'll have to let it go. On page 174, we have the Tridentine doctrine on original sin. We looked at it briefly in the church history class this morning. I won't take any time. I'll just simply say that Hodge is much gentler with Trent than I am on this original sin. I don't think he's nearly as severe as he could be, though most of what he says is true enough, but it's what he doesn't say that's surprising. The same way with justification. I don't know what it is in Hodge at a certain point, but he doesn't seem to recognize the gravity of the Council of Trent as much as you would expect him to do, as much as most of the Protestant theologians have done. It isn't I who'm out of step here, it's Hodge who's out of step. I mean, talking about a consensus now, you could very well say to yourself, Gerstner, aren't you the extreme if you're being more severe on Trent than Charles Hodge? I am more severe than Charles Hodge is, but I'm more with a consensus on that. He is exceptionally lenient rather than I'm being exceptionally severe on this point. If you could take my word for it, I can't possibly prove it to you. But I think it is true, and I can't quite understand it. It's a very serious matter because, of course, you have people, as you know, Howard going into the Roman Church, other people going into the Roman Church as if this was some sort of a trivial difference that we have with Rome. It's a momentous difference in their opinion and our opinion. As I hastily mentioned at the end of that lesson this morning, what's all this about justification? All this about justification is a way of life and way of damnation. That's how serious it is, and act as if it's something you can do the way you change from a Presbyterian church to a Reformed church or an Episcopal church or something like that. Just shows that somebody's selling the Reformation short. I'm not saying Hodge does that, but Hodge is surprisingly lenient with it, not just here but elsewhere. I mean, I nearly passed out when I was reading something at Princeton Seminary Library a couple summers ago. I couldn't believe Charles Hodge would write that. I don't know what, he had a soft underbelly at a certain point. For some reason I don't understand, and so on. It's partly a tribute to Hodge. Let's put it this way, he will always state anything favorable that he thinks he can say. That's a good thing. That's a good thing in anybody. We ought to do that, put the best possible construction on something. And he would never justify, by that spirit, putting a good justification, good construction on something that doesn't merit that kind of construction. You understand? But I think he's doing it to a degree anyway, and I think it grows out of his generally genial and gracious spirit. Here I'm sort of finding fault with my father in the faith at this point, at the same time trying to point out that the virtue behind the vice. The virtue is that he tries to put the best possible construction on any particular view, including Rome. Don't misunderstand me. He's not saying that the Reformation was a mistake or anything like that. He's very definitely a Reformation theologian, but at the same time he doesn't recognize how seriously Rome has erred, as one would suppose he would. The true doctrine of the Church of Rome, it develops in the next section here, and then comes the Protestant doctrine on page 180, and I'll just mention the items here. I do want to say something about Edwards, whom he critiques very thoroughly, and an area where Edwards is usually critiqued pretty thoroughly, but I think I'd like to say something in Edwards' defense there. From the Protestant doctrine of sin, he thinks, first of all, sin's a specific evil, and secondly, it's related to law, and thirdly, on page 182, to the law of God, and then the extent of the law's demands, and sin is not confined to acts of the will. And that's the tendency of the New England theologians after Edwards. That's what Hodge is fighting there. Sin is one of conformity to the law of God. This is all part of the general definition. Sin includes guilt and pollution. And then, any question on that? As I say, I'm just skimming right now, and we've already commented on immediate imputation and the other, and I do want to take a look before we finish at the critique of Edwards here and the realistic theory while he's at it. But that comes on page 216 and 17, so let me just ask if there's any questions you have about any of this material before that point. Anything I've just been hastily referring to. I've not even been summarizing that. I think you're somewhat familiar with the Protestant doctrine of sin. You wouldn't get all of these illusions that he has. For some strange reason, he doesn't mention the Hopkins and the New England theologians, though a couple of pages here are very definitely directed against that tradition, but for some reason he doesn't seem to want to mention that. I don't know quite why. It was a running debate in his day. He was very much concerned with it. He felt that the New Englanders, after Edwards, not Edwards himself, but after Edwards, really fell away from Reformed theology. If there's no question before that, then let me, since you know I have this very special interest in Edwards, and Edwards is, of course, monumental in American theology, take a look at that. The realistic view, and then he takes Edwards as an illustration of it on page 216. Those who reject the untenable doctrine of pre-existence, that is, that the soul exists before the body is generated in marriage, Origin and some other held, he's critiqued that before, and it goes on to say that those who reject the untenable doctrine of the pre-existence of souls and yet hold to the principle that guilt can attach only to what is due to our agency are driven to assume that Adam and his race are in such a sense one, and that his act of disobedience was literally your act and my act. It wasn't just Adam's act, it was your act and my act. John Gerstner did it. You did it, as well, as they're saying. And that's very true. That's exactly what the realistic view, and Edwards in particular, does say, as we'll see in a moment. And consequently, that they are as truly personally guilty on account of it as Adam himself was. Now, obviously, if I sinned, and not just Adam, man, there's no argument about my being guilty. Nobody's going to argue about him being guilty of his own sins. And if he can prove to me that what Adam did, John Gerstner did, then I have no objections whatever. You realize why this view would be advanced, because people can't quite see why would I be responsible for what Adam did centuries ago? I didn't know the man, and so I had anything to do with him, and so on. You can see how questions are always coming up all over the block about that type of thing. Well, someone can say, well, I'm saying, why should I be responsible for somebody else's sin, and so on. Isn't anybody else's sin except yours, John Gerstner, and so on. Well, you once pinned me the blame for that particular sin, and of course, if I can't show that I didn't do it or something like that, I certainly can't have any objection for being blamed for my sins. And that's what they're trying to do in a way that the representation view doesn't do, you see. He represented me. And the way you defend that is on the ground that God appointed him as a representative. Can you deny that that can be done? No, you can't. But you have to go through a bit of a rigmarole in proving it. But if, on the other hand, he can show me that I sinned in the garden, I did it, then of course that's the end of all objection there. It has a directness about it that the other view does not possess, and an appeal, if it can be carried off, as Hodge does not think it can be. But that's the motivation of it, continuing that, and consequently that they are as truly responsibly personally guilty on account of it as Adam himself was, and that the inherent corruption flowing from that act belongs to us in the same sense and the same way that it belonged to him. His sin, it is therefore said, and this is a quote from Edwards, though he doesn't indicate it for some reason or other. As a matter, it's ours. His sin, is therefore said, is ours, not because it's imputed to us, but it's imputed to us because it's truly and properly ours. That isn't Edwards' language. He has said the equivalent of it, and he doesn't give any reference to it, and that's Edwards' way of expressing it. The reason you're guilty of Adam's sin is that you did Adam's sin. That's the way he put it. We have constantly to contend with the ambiguity of terms, says Hodge. There is a sense in which the above proposition is perfectly true, and there is a sense in which it is not true. It is true that the righteousness of Christ is imputed to us because it is ours, according to the terms of the covenant of grace, because it was wrought out for us by our great head and representative who obeyed and suffered in our stead. But it is not true that it is ours in the sense that we were the agents by whom that righteousness was effected, or the person in whom it adheres. Now that's with respect to justification. I fulfilled the law in Christ. I suffered full punishment for it in Christ. I died with Christ. I rose with Christ. Yeah, all that is true, but that means representatively. Not that I, John Gerstner, did it, but that I, John Gerstner, as a person of faith, identified with Christ did it. Yes, but this is saying something more than that. This is saying that even with respect to Christ, I did it, he's saying, and now particularly with respect to Adam. In like manner, Adam's sin may be said to be imputed to us because it's ours, inasmuch as it's a sin of the divinely constituted head and representative of our faith. But it is not ours in the same sense in which it was his. I didn't do it. I'm responsible for it because he did it as my representative, says Hodge. Yes, in that sense it's my sin, but not in the sense that I did it, which is what Jonathan Edwards is saying. That's nonsense. It is true, it's ours. It can't be more ours than it actually is because he was our divinely appointed rep. But to go the second mile and actually say it is ours in the sense that we did it just the same way that Adam did it, that's too much for Charles Hodge. It's not ours in the same sense in which it was his. It was not our act, that is, an act in which our reason, will, and conscience were exercised. There is a sense in which the act of an agent is the act of the principle. It binds him in law as effectually as he could bind himself, but he is not on that account the efficient agent of the act. The sense in which many assert that the act of Adam was our act is that the same numerical nature or substance, the same reason and will which existed and acted in Adam belonged to us, so that we were truly and properly the agents of his apostasy. Now, if you haven't read this material before, you say, you mean to tell me Jonathan Edwards is actually saying it? Yeah, he's really saying it. And you're probably saying to yourself, well, boy, he must have been out of his mind. It's no wonder Hodge is distressed with him at this particular point. You're hearing him correctly. This is what Edwards is saying. But now, Hodge gives a characteristically clear and fair exposition of why Edwards says what on the surface of it seems preposterous. The assumption which President Edwards, that's the way they usually distinguish from his son, though his son was also the president of the college, so it's a rather arbitrary way of doing it. The assumption which President Edwards undertakes to controvert is that Adam and his posterity are not one but entirely distinct agents. You recognize that's the standard doctrine. You're a distinct agent, every one of you, and so am I. And Adam's another person. He's not I, he's not you. No, you're a distinct person. He represented us, yes, but we're not one and the same person. But this is exactly what Edwards is controverting, namely that Adam and his posterity are not one, but entirely distinct agents. He's going to show they are one, and they're not distinct agents. The theory on which he endeavors to prove that Adam and his posterity were one agent is not exactly the old realistic theory. It is rather a theory of his own and depends on his peculiar views of oneness or identity. According to him, all oneness depends upon the arbitrary constitution of God. I may say this, that in the middle of April, I have to go over to the Covenant Seminary in St. Louis and deliver some lectures on Edwards' theory of virtue. And the way I intend to open is that Edwards, though he's recognized as a great champion of Reformed theology, has about a half a dozen doctrines where he's roundly criticized by Reformed theologians, and the nature of virtue is one of them. Here's another one. This is a doctrine where he definitely represents a minority report. You've been familiar with the concept of seeking, which again is a minority report in Reformed theology. There are about a half a dozen doctrines like that which Edwards developed, which are held in suspicion by fellow Reformed theologians. And Hodge is here representing a consensus which is really against Edwards on this. Edwards represents a distinctly minority viewpoint. When Yale University Press recently published and edited his great Christian doctrine of original sin, they focused on that. Because you see, it is, as Hodge indicates, it's even different from most realistic thinking, say Augustinian thinking. It's a unique thing, and whenever anybody finds a great thinker such as Edwards coming up with an idea that has never previously appeared in the history of the race, of course it stops academic traffic, and they tend to concentrate on it. And, you know, coming from Edwards, it's worthy of consideration, however preposterous it may sound at first glance. And so you read all the more carefully, first of all, because it's odd and unusual. And then because Edwards is such a prodigious thinker, you begin to say to yourself, there's more here than meets the eye. Maybe this is worthy of more consideration than even Hodge has given it. But at any rate, let's see. He says, according to him, Edwards, all oneness depends upon the arbitrary constitution of God. The only way, that is the will of God, arbitrary not in the sense of non-rational, but arbitrary in the sense of his decree that makes you the same person from day to day. I've lived for 71 years, and the only reason this is the same John Gerstner who was here last year, I was born 71 years ago, is because God has, by an act of will, constituted me the same person. That's what Jonathan Edwards really does believe, and it puts Hodge into a state of shock. The only reason, now he goes on with his illustration, the only reason why a full-grown tree is the same with its first germ, or that the body of an adult man is the same with his infant frame, is that God so wills to regard them, according to Edwards. No creature is one and the same in the different periods of its existence. As soon as he starts to talk this way, we get on his trolley. We hear this all the time, that the human body changes every 7 years, You know that that's not the same body. I don't know how many different bodies I've had in my years and so on. You had a number of different bodies. We all know that. Well, Edwards has gone far down that particular path here. No creature is one and the same in the different periods of its existence, certainly as far as the body is concerned, we'd say that, because it is numerically one and the same substance or life or organism, but simply because God, quote, treats them as one by communicating to them like properties, relations, and circumstances, and so leads us to regard and treat them as one. If the existence, he says, of created substance in each successive moment be wholly the effect of God's immediate power in that moment. Now, here you're getting to get the argument. If the existence of created substance, your created substance and my created substance, for example, in each successive moment, because we've been here for nearly 2 hours now and so on, we're still the same persons we were when we came in here at 7 o'clock and so on. If that is the case, in each successive moment, it's wholly the effect of God's immediate power in that moment. He is the one who has kept our identity during these last 2 hours, during all these years which we may have lived here, without any dependence on prior existence. I was before you here last week and so on. Because I existed last week, I haven't preserved my own existence this past week so that I appear before you now talking seemingly the same person who talked to you a week ago. I know that. You know that. You know full well John Gerstner has not preserved his own being. And you know you haven't done that. That's perfectly obvious. So we're beginning to say, look, this may not be as crazy as it sounds at first. So certainly that is true. I don't account for my continued existence, not only from last week to this week, but from the moment I was born. I didn't account for my continuing in existence. We know that you and I are absolutely dependent on God every moment. So that's all right, Edwards. We can go with you on that. It's God's immediate power in that moment. That's the only thing that keeps you existing now. It's the only thing that keeps me existing now. We all admit that. Without any dependence on prior existence. What he means by that, it isn't the fact that you've lived 18 years, or you've lived 40 years, or you've lived 70 years, or something like that, that accounts for it. It's his immediate power alone. It doesn't make any difference whether you're a kid or whether you're an old man or whatever it is. It's his power. It is not my or your previous existence that accounts for it, and so on, without any dependence on prior existence, as much as the first creation out of nothing. We're just as dependent now as when we were first brought into being, is what he's saying. And again, I don't think you'd argue with that. As much as the first creation out of nothing, then what exists at this moment by this power is a new effect, and simply and absolutely considered not the same with any past existence, though it be like it, and follows it according to a certain established method. And there's no identity or oneness in the case, but what depends on the arbitrary constitution of the Creator, who by his wise and sovereign establishment so unites successive new effects that he treats them as one. I'm looking at a batch of new effects, you see, people who get different people have been preserved in the last week and so on. You look like the people I was talking to last week and so on, but I know full well you haven't preserved your own existence. It's God who accounts for your existence. You're just a continued series of effects of his creative power, is what Edwards is saying in Original Sin that he's quoting here. Now, he says, Edwards uses two illustrations by which he makes his meaning perfectly plain. And Hodge is going to present this and critique it. And perhaps we can get the idea by the illustration here. He says he uses two illustrations which make his meaning perfectly plain. The brightness of the moon seems to us a permanent thing, but it is really a new effect produced every moment. It ceases and is renewed in every successive point of time, and so becomes altogether a new effect at each instant. It is no more numerically the same thing with that which existed in the preceding moment than the sound of the wind that blows now is individually the same sound of the wind which blew just before. What is true of the brightness of the moon, he said, must be true also of its solidity and of everything else belonging to its substance. Again, he says, images of things placed before a mirror seem to remain precisely the same. with a continuing perfect identity, but it is known to be otherwise. See, they knew even in the 18th century that that image you see in a mirror depends on a constant influx of rays from your body. Everybody knew that. Even when they were assuming that the person whom you saw in the mirror was the same, they recognized that the image in the mirror was constantly changing. And Edwards is using that, as well as the moon, as an illustration of what he's talking about, and Hodge is here presenting before he critiques it. But it is known to be otherwise. That is, that image in the mirror is definitely not an unchangeable substance. Everybody knows that. There's no dispute on that point. Hodge would admit that. Edwards would admit it. Everybody, the Royal Science Academy recognized it at that time, and so on. The images are constantly renewed by the impression and reflection of new rays of light. The image which exists this moment is not at all derived from the image which existed the last preceding moment. It is no more numerically the same than if painted anew by an artist with colors which vanish as soon as they are put on. Now comes Hodge's critique. He says the obvious fallacy of these illustrations is that the cases are apparently, but not really, alike. The fact that the moon is a different moon from what it was before, and that this image is a different and changing thing, and so on, don't really illustrate what Edwards is trying to prove. The brightness of the moon and the image on a mirror are not substances having continued existence. The soul of a man, according to Hodge, and he represents the majority opinion, that is a continuing substance. And you can't make it a continuing creation by God on the basis of an argument from analogy from the moon and the mirror, because the brightness of the moon is just a reflection of the substance of the moon, and the image in a mirror is nothing but an image or a reflection of the rays from your body. Now, I would say his critique is invalid here for this reason. What Edwards is talking about in the moon, he does use the expression brightness of the moon, but he's talking about the moon as such. The moon is so characterized that it does emit rays, reflections from the sun, and so on. That's perfectly true. So he talks about the moon and the rays interchangeably. But he's not just talking about the rays or the reflection of the moon. He's talking about the moon itself. And in his argument in Original Sin that Hodge is referring to here, he says that moon at one moment is, of course, not the producer of the moon at the next moment. For one thing, it's in a different place. And for another thing, it doesn't have any power to reproduce itself. This is a different moon in the sense that it is created afresh by God. He's talking about a substance there, not just the rays. He's talking about the substance. Now, when he uses the analogy of the mirror, he is not talking about the substance. The point Hodge seems to be missing here is that that what Edwards is saying is that we all know that that reflection of us in the mirror does change. Yet it seems to be the same thing. And I carried it out literally, the place where I'm staying right now, just looking at that full-length mirror there, and looking at myself, and I think, I know, there I look exactly the same. I don't look as if I'm changing in the mirror anymore than the person standing before the mirror, but I know, and they knew even in the 18th century, even if they thought that I was a continuing person, that image definitely was not. And all that Edwards is saying here is that is an illustration of the fact that something can look as if it's the same thing without being the same thing. Everybody knows that image in the mirror looks like the same person and is not the same person. That's all he's trying to say. It is perfectly true. I look at Meek back there, and so he looks like the same Meek I saw last week, and such things, that he looks that way. But the fact that he looks that way doesn't prove he's exactly the same person any more than the fact that his image in a mirror would look just like him proves that image is the same thing. We all know that. The one thing, in other words, the moon is a substantive argument. He's talking about the substance of the moon being different from moment to moment for the simple reason that the moon doesn't reproduce itself. It can't account for its continued existence. That has to go back to the Creator, who makes it and there attributes a certain unity to it. And the same thing with persons here. So Hodge is not really refuting Edwards's analogies here as well as he thinks he actually is. Now, if you'll indulge me a little bit more, I'll look at this critique and still try to save you a minute or two to raise a question. But on 219, he gives his objections to the doctrine. Number one is that this is he admits at the end of that paragraph, it's surely just as conceivable or intelligible that God should will the continuous existence of the things which he creates as that he should create them anew at every successive moment. Now, see, he's admitting in that it's at least theoretically possible that the reason you seem to have an identity is the fact that God has constituted you an identity. Now, all Hodge is saying here is not that Edwards is wrong, but that you could entertain just as easily the idea that there's a continuing substance here, which is the usual view. Now, since the time is running out, let me give my critique of that. As soon as you say that I am a continuing substance, for example, that God has created me that way, and that is the way most people think, and no doubt about it, and Edwards is unusual in there, no question about that. But if you realize what you're saying, when you say that you, I, are continuing substances, you realize you have something which really characterizes only deity. There is only one independent, immutable, everlastingly unchanging substance, and that is God. There is no such thing. Remember when we discussed the attributes of God, there's no such thing as the communication of unique divine attributes. He can't communicate infinity to us. He can't communicate independence to us. He can't communicate immutability to us. It's impossible to communicate attributes which belong only to deity. But if you're thinking of me as a created substance which has been created by God with that quality of a continuing substance, I think what Edwards is saying here is you actually are confusing yourself and me with deity. The only substance which exists in and of itself and continues in and of itself is the divine being. The only way you and I have any kind of existence at any time is by divine power. Everybody admits that. Edwards would say that divine power has to be divine creation, because the creation of me at a moment gives me no power to recreate myself or continue myself. It has to depend on the constant creation of God. So I won't go through all the criticisms that Hodge gives here, but I do think they are all answerable, and that though the doctrine that Edwards says is admittedly unique and a minority report, I frankly don't know how you can avoid it. And I don't think Hodge has penetrated to it properly, but I can see why he's so very much concerned with it. But I promised you a last question if anybody wants to raise the matter before we go on to an easier and more circumscribable subject next time on the matter of free agency. But any last question before we close shop? Yes, Rich.
Do you think this is a direct result of the Edwardian view toward first and second causes?
Yeah, that's very definitely related to it. God's the first cause, ultimately, and so on. But very Augustinian in this type of thinking, but perhaps more thorough than Augustine. Augustine wobbled a little bit. Edwards didn't wobble particularly, partly the fact he came much later than Augustine and had the benefit of studying Augustine. No, not intensely, not a special student. But at any rate, close with this general observation here that what we're talking about now, that may have gotten lost in that detail, is the way this applies to the fall. See, it's agreed, you understand here, that Adam represented us all. All orthodoxy teaches that. The covenant or federal headship view is that we were represented by Adam. And we didn't sin, literally, but we were held responsible because we did sin representatively. Now, Edwards and the realists generally are taking that a step further. This is what's called a realistic view in Hodge here. They take it a step further and say we were in Adam in such a way that his act was our act. That's the general view. The precise form of it that Hodge is considering here is the Edwardsian form. We were in him in the only sense in which there is any meaning to the word identity. The only identity I have over 71 years of existence is the fact that God has attributed these different states of one named John Gerstner to the same person. That's the only way we have it. And since that is the case, the only identity which you or I possess, according to Edwards here, is an identity which God attributes to us, who himself creates us in innumerable recreations and so on. By the same token, he can easily identify us with Adam. He identifies us with ourselves. And if that is true, Edwards is saying, we shouldn't be surprised that in Adam we sinned. literally sin, not representatively, but dynamically, because God constituted us one with Adam, just as truly as he constitutes us one with ourselves. As he constitutes John Gerstner one with John Gerstner, he also constitutes John Gerstner one with Adam. And what Adam did, John Gerstner did. And if you can accept the idea that the only identity of personality which there is for you and me is a divine constitution, then you shouldn't be surprised that we should have a divine constitution of identity with Adam, so that literally you're not being punished for something you didn't do, or did do even representatively, but for something you actually did do, by the same kind of identity with Adam which you have with ourselves. You can see why that thing would appeal if it's true. If it's not true and so on, you can see why it would drive Hodge up the wall. But shall we close with a word of prayer and look forward to free agency next week? Our Father, we thank thee for the efforts of thy servants through the ages to understand what thou hast revealed in thy word. And we thank thee that though we lose ourselves at times in some of their interpretations and efforts to get beneath the words that are given to us to understand what lie back of them, that nevertheless thy word comes through clear. We do know that we're responsible for Adam's sin, and that that's the reason the world is in this fallen condition, and that redemption is absolutely necessary. And whatever the explanations of that in its fullness may be, we thank thee for them, but at the same time we thank thee that the basic clarity, the fundamentals of the faith, come through to us from thy holy word, and that we have one named Jesus who identified himself with our guilt by taking our sin, who knew no sin, and dying and removing it for all those who by faith are one with him. Dismiss us with that blessing, O God, and help us, we pray thee, to live to the praise of the grace of him who lives in us for his glory. Amen.
So much for God changing his mind on that issue. Bruce and I were getting, he said, boy, we're talking about God changing his
How's my boy feeling this morning, Chris?
Very good.